Formal or structural fallacies involve problems with the logic of an argument. They violate what we've called the logic condition. Content fallacies involve problems with the truth or plausibility of one of the premises of an argument. They violate what we've called the truth condition. But some fallacies don't fit easily into either of these categories. Sometimes an argument is bad because the arguer either isn't willing or isn't able to reason well. This is a different kind of problem than what we've seen before. In part 3 of this tutorial course, we'll be looking at fallacies that fall into this category, that are best viewed as violations of the basic rules or principles on which rational argumentation depends. In this video, we'll introduce a few of these rules. Here's an example of the kind of rule we're talking about. You can't argue with someone who is intentionally trying to mislead or deceive you. In short, if someone is willing to lie to persuade you of their position, to assert a premise is true when they know it's false, or vice versa, and you know that they're intentionally misleading you, then there's no point in engaging their argument, unless it's to uncover the lies and unmask the deception. Genuine argumentation requires that all parties be open to rational persuasion, and a willingness to lie or mislead indicates that the person really is more interested in rhetoric and persuasion than offering and responding to good reasons. Rule number 2. You can't argue with someone who is unwilling to reason well. Rule number 1 is really just a special case of this rule. This is very broad, I know, but I'm thinking of cases where someone's mind is clearly made up, and their main aim is to convert people to their side, or undermine opposing views, by whatever means that are judged to be most effective. We can all think of examples of people or occupations that are prone to this. Strongly ideological politicians come to mind, paid spokespersons and spin doctors, lawyers advocating for a client, religious ideologues, anyone who is invested in a certain position or outcome who is not genuinely open to rational persuasion from opposing viewpoints, and who is willing to use rhetorical devices in place of good argumentation to further their case. In cases like this, it really makes no sense to argue with such people, because even though they may deploy arguments on occasion, they're not really engaged in argumentation. Rule number 3. You can't argue with someone who is unable to reason well. Here I'm thinking of cases like if someone is very upset or very emotional, they're often not able to reason well, and if that's the case, arguing with them really may not be appropriate. Also, younger children don't have as developed a capacity for reason as adults, so arguing with them is often not appropriate either. We have to admit that some adults really can have a very difficult time following the logic of more complex arguments. In such cases, just repeating the argument isn't helpful. Some other strategy is called for, maybe simplifying the argument or tutoring the person on how the logic works, using other examples that are easier to grasp. But when we're tutoring or educating someone, we're not arguing anymore, we're doing something different. Rule number 4. An argument has to give reasons for believing or accepting the conclusion. Now, of course, this is obvious. It's part of the definition of an argument. But as we'll see, there are whole categories of fallacies where the main problem is that the argument doesn't actually give its intended audience any reasons to accept the conclusion. So the take-home message is that if these rules are violated, then the conditions for genuine argumentation simply aren't present. And the final point to note, which we'll see in part 3 of this tutorial course, is that there are some important fallacies that are really best understood as violations of the rules of rational argumentation. We'll look at the straw man or straw person fallacy, the red herring fallacy, and the fallacy of begging the question as examples.